Hey everyone. Today we're going all the way back to the early 1970s, right back to the golden age of SLR design. It's the Pentax ES II. The ES II was the last screw mount Pentax SLR to be made, and it's turned 50 this year, just like Kosmo Foto. So we're not only wishing it a very happy 50th birthday, but this also happens to be my favorite SLR out of all the dozens, scores, maybe even hundreds I've used over the years. It's the camera that I would take with me on a trip around the world more than any other. And I want to explain why, because after using these for 15 years, I'm no less enthusiastic about shooting with them than I was when I first picked them up. So the Pentax ES II is essentially the last of the Spotmatic family. If you've looked around at the history of film cameras, you'll have no doubt come across Pentax's Spotmatic family. They were launched in the early 1960s. All of them were screw mount SLRs using the screw lenses that not only Pentax but other companies like Praktica and Ricoh and Chinon, KMZ and the USSR all made lenses for. The M42 screw mount, screw in and out just like an old light bulb. They were a non-proprietary lens brand. That meant that you didn't have to pay licenses in order to make lenses. They weren't owned by a particular lens or camera manufacturer. What that meant was that you didn't have to pay licenses if you're a lens maker, and you didn't have to pay licenses if you're a camera maker. So you had all sorts of companies making the camera bodies, and sometimes they were making lenses too. And you had a lot of third-party lens manufacturers also making lenses for M42 mount. You'll hear the M42 mount being referred to by a number of names: Pentax screw mount, the universal screw mount, the M42 mount, the Praktica mount, just the screw mount. Lots of camera manufacturers were making cameras for the screw mount during the 60s. But what Pentax did was they made both a family of Spotmatic cameras, sort of improving the design every few years, also just a wonderful range of lenses for them. So these were known as Takumar lenses. And in the early 1970s, these sort of big metal heavy cameras were still in vogue, but various things were changing. There was increasing automation in cameras. So camera manufacturers had already brought in things like through the lens metering, even spot metering in some cameras. There was this increasing desire to make cameras think more. The ideal was that you would have a camera where it would work out the aperture and the shutter speed, leaving you free to just compose and focus. So the dream was a Spotmatic where the camera could read the light coming through the lens, work out the best shutter speed, and set that without the photographer having to get involved at all. So this process began with a camera which came out in 1971 called the Electro Spotmatic. Unless you live in Japan, the Electro Spotmatic is a pretty rare camera. It turns out they were only made for a year and they weren't exported outside of Japan. And that's because there were all sorts of problems with trying to work out this computer-controlled exposure system, incredibly unreliable, and all sorts of problems with the circuit boards as well. So Pentax just decided to keep them in Japan and not risk soiling the Spotmatic name with this temperamental camera. A year later, they released an improved model called the ES. So this was essentially exactly the same camera as the ES II, apart from a few changes here and there. its metering system could cope with film speeds up to 1600 instead of 3200 for the ES2. And it also had a different battery compartment. Here on the ES2, it's under the lens mount here. On the ES, it's just here, like sort of buried into the camera body. ESs tend to be a bit thicker and a bit taller because I was still trying to work out the correct circuitry to undertake all these automatic calculations and movements that needed to be done. Pentax decided that the job wasn't done, and in 1973 they released the ES2. So it was essentially the third version of the Spotmatic. By this stage, you know, Spotmatic isn't even mentioned, and it's, you know, what does ES stand for? Does it still stand for Spotmatic, or does it stand for electronic shutter? Well, it depends on who you ask. I just know them as ES2s. And there's a reason that I picked up these cameras. Partly it's because I like M42 cameras. I've got a load of Prakticas and Zenits. I learnt on a Praktica when I first got into film photography. And I soon realized how good Spotmatics were, and especially how good the Spotmatic Takumar lenses were. And in 2007, I was shooting the Manic Street Preachers at a sound check for a music photography project I was doing. Shooting sound checks on black and white film. And I had a couple of rolls of film left over. I'd finished shooting the sound check. The band's PR very kindly gave me a photo pass for the gig. So I hung around and thought, you know, I'll just shoot a couple of rolls of film. And I found myself in the photo pit with a screw mount camera, a Voigtlander Bessiflex. And I noticed this photographer stood next to me. A woman, black hair. She had a Pentax. And this is 2007, so all the other gig photographers are all shooting on digital cameras. And we're the only people shooting film. So in between songs, I sort of introduce myself, say hello, sort of point to the Pentax. And then I realize who it is. And the woman I was taking pictures alongside was Penny Smith. Even if you don't think you've seen a Penny Smith image, I can assure you have. Penny Smith took the picture which became the cover of the Clash's London Calling album, which was released in 1980. It's one of the classic live photography images. It shows the bassist of the Clash, Paul Simonon, about to smash his bass onto the ground. It was taken side of stage at a theatre in New York when Penny Smith was touring with the Clash on a US tour. Shot on Tri-X, shot on the characteristic Takumar lenses, just an absolutely extraordinary shot. And so, you know, during a little break in between songs, I let Penny Smith know that I loved that picture and you know, thought it was amazing. And she said, oh, well, I took it on this camera. And I thought, oh, she took it on an ES2. And she said, no, I took it on this actual camera, and gave me the camera. She said, well, why don't you look through the viewfinder? So I found myself looking at the Manic Street Preachers through the same viewfinder that had shot the cover of London Calling. I find myself wanting to buy an ES2. I think by the end of that week, I bought two of them, and I don't think either of them cost me more than £40. This is, you know, mid-2000s when the prices of film cameras was on the slide. And pretty soon I realized what an amazing little camera this is. And there was a period where if I was traveling, if I was visiting places like Istanbul, which I used to go to regularly to, you know, take pictures or just, you know, have a week away, I'd just be taking one of my ES2s along with me. And there's a reason for that. Like, they're just such a wonderfully ergonomic camera, a wonderfully ergonomic SLR. There is almost nothing that's extraneous on this camera. It's got a really simple top plate. It has everything you need to take creative photography. Just that really sort of classic early 70s SLR design. There's just enough automation to make taking pictures easier, but you are still involved as a photographer. You are still making creative decisions. So I want to talk about how Pentax managed to square the circle of the kind of dumb M42 mount. Early M42 lenses had little more than an aperture pin. So the pin gets pushed in and the aperture drops down to, the selected aperture setting. What that means is the viewfinder gets pretty dim, and so you're constantly having to put the lens back to a wide aperture setting like f2.8 just so that you can see through the viewfinder properly. The limitations of the M42 mount and the fact that it didn't have the best automatic diaphragm, especially compared to Nikon cameras, for instance, meant that Spotmatics were seen as a enthusiast camera, but not something that a professional would use. And I suppose this was the closest that the Spotmatic line came to professional level, and that's because of what Pentax did with the lenses. So they came up with a groove in the back of the lens on these lenses, which are called SMC super multi-coated Takumars. And you have this tab set in this groove in the back of the lens. And what that does is that interacts with a lever inside the camera. What this means is the camera knows what aperture the lens is set at, and it knows how much light is being let in, and it can work out what shutter speed to use. So it's constantly getting information from the lens. So what's happening is as you move the aperture on the lens across, that little tab inside the lens is moving along that groove, and that's translating information to the camera. So that's letting it know what aperture the lens is open to, and so it sets that shutter speed accordingly. It's a sort of partly manual computer system. It works really well. What it turns this camera into is an aperture-priority SLR. So it means I set the camera to f5.6. I put it up to my eye with the ISO at 100 and the lens set at 5.6. I can see on the right hand side that I'm getting half a second. Yeah, it sounds about right. Half a second. So I'm choosing the aperture and the camera is choosing the correct shutter speed. Now, there's another nice aspect to this camera is when in auto mode, the ES2's computerized brain is not only working out what the best shutter speed is, but it's also electronically controlling the shutter. So that means that it's no longer beholden to the set shutter speeds that you would find on an average manual SLR at the time. What this means in effect is that if the ES2's metering system thinks that 1/543rd of a second is the best shutter speed for that aperture you've chosen, that's the speed the shutter runs at. So it's like supposedly a lot more accurate, especially if you're shooting something like slide film. You suddenly have all these intermediate shutter speeds that are available to you. Now that's par for the course now, but this was space age stuff in the early 1970s. And so, certain photographers sort of leapt on this as a real bonus to have in a camera. Some other nice features of this camera is the sensitivity of the meter. It goes up to 3200. So that means you can use this to take, low light shots. You can use films like Ilford Delta 3200 or Kodak P3200 to really get those sort of atmospheric low light shots. There's an exposure compensation system, so you can bracket. If you're in some tricky lighting, you can bracket 2 times the exposure or half the exposure. Electronic shutter obviously means you need batteries, but if your batteries conk out, then the ES II had a bunch of backup speeds. You could shoot at anything from 1/60th up to 1,000th of a second on manual speed, so you didn't need batteries to power the shutter anymore. It did mean that light metering wouldn't work, so you just have to be sure that you could kind of guess the exposure yourself. But it's a nice backup to have. There's even a viewfinder blind in case you're shooting astronomical shots and you don't want any light coming in through the back of the viewfinder. Just a really great package. Like I said earlier, just everything you need for creative photography without a load of extraneous nonsense getting in the way. Metal heavy, so it's just got that 70s robustness. Another shout out to the Takumar lenses, not just the SMC super multi-coated lenses, but any of the Takumars that were made for Spotmatics. Just fantastic, fantastic lenses. They made an enormous variety of them. This one has the classic 51.4 SMC Takumar. One of the greatest lenses ever made for film cameras, still really usable today. Gives characteristic soap bubble bokeh when it's used wide open. Great color rendition, wonderful with a yellow filter for black and white. This other ES II I have here has another of the less common but still very usable lenses. This is the 120 2.8 portrait lens. I haven't really come across any Takumar lenses that I wouldn't wholeheartedly recommend. Pentax really did get this family of lenses right at the first go. And while they constantly improved them, the basic designs were so sound that it just meant that they were just improving upon greatness rather than having to reinvent the wheel the whole time. So if somebody gave me a whole bunch of money, a year off work, and a round the world ticket, you can be sure that at least 2 of these are coming in the camera bag with me, along with a whole bunch of Takumar lenses. Happy 50th birthday, Pentax ES II. If you want to see more pictures taken on the ES II, then check out Kosmo Foto's Flickr, where there's hundreds of pictures taken over the years. And also read the Kosmo Foto review of this camera from a few months ago. Not only is there a little more information about the camera, but there's also another Rockstar related story. The time that we shot this ES II with Queen's Brian May.